Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Reportage, Essays on the New World Order by James Corbett. On this channel you've seen I've done quite a few documentaries of James Corbett's on Film Club, so this is the first time that we're looking at a book of his, and I think this might actually be his first book. It reads like the documentaries that he produces, so I think a lot of the essays in here were the basis of scripts, or they came from scripts and he polished them up to make them into essays. Wide-ranging, talking about everything from 9/11 to COVID to financial policy to politics. So there's lots of different things he covers, and I would say this book is mostly good. The only challenges I have are with his political you could say philosophy, which I'll get to towards the end. I want to start with the good news first because, as I say, this book is mostly good news, and any sort of bad news is really just due down to his particular worldview, which we'll address in due time. But as I say, let's start with the good stuff first. So this first part is from an essay called Up Down Politics, and he characterizes uppist versus downist. If you're familiar with Gulliver's Travels, if you're familiar with 1984, there is this idea of these two opposing parties, but realistically they're coordinating with each other in a certain sense. Is there a coordinated uppist movement? As we shall see, there certainly is. How then does that movement operate, and who is behind it? We would be hard-pressed to find a better description of how the uppist movement controls the left-right political spectrum than the one found in Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, the 1,300-plus page magnum opus of celebrated historian Carroll Quigley. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea, acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. And this is part of why we see AIPAC putting money into both parties so that no matter what changes, Israel gets full support from either the blue team or the red team. By limiting the chief concerns of politics to a handful of issues that can be staked out by one or the other of the two controlled sides of the argument, uppists can lead an entire society toward a certain goal in the exact same way that we move from one point to another. First, by taking a step with the right foot, then the left, then the right, and so on. This tactic for gaining political consent is easy enough for alert downists to see, and to see through. But when the uppists deploy all forms of psychological manipulation, from tribal colors, red versus blue, to misleading visualizations, right versus left, to false dichotomies, welfare state versus warfare state, unsuspecting downists on both sides of the political aisle are lured into supporting one or another aspect of the same uppist agenda, even when that agenda works against all downists' best interests. And I think here he goes on to point out how the Tea Party in America was co-opted, how the Occupy movement was co-opted, both of them representing ostensibly different ideas and different interests, and then they got flooded by the uppists and co-opted to their own ends, and then ultimately neutered. How to understand the uppist popping of the housing bubble in 2007, a bubble that they themselves had spent much of the previous decade expanding? Superficially, it would appear that, by setting the stage for the subprime mortgage meltdown, the uppists had committed a self-defeating act of self-destruction. But we know that the architects of the uppist financial order would never purposely self-immolate. We must conclude, then, that the near collapse of the world economic system was, in fact, the uppists' boldest move yet in an all-out attack on their true enemy, the downists. And the downists would be anybody who's awake, people who know the story about COVID, who know the story about the 2020 election, who know the story about 9/11, who know the story about Oklahoma City. I think Corbett would characterize these people as downists. To understand this point, we must first make a crucial distinction between currency and wealth. Currency is merely an instrument of exchange. Wealth, however, is power. From the up-down perspective, we can see that the bankster's aim is not to accumulate currency, but rather to gain the power afforded by controlling the currency. If there is an opportunity to sacrifice some currency for actual power and control, you can bet your bottom dollar the uppest banksters will jump at it. Donald Trump's 2016 presidential election campaign drew from the same playbook of misdirection and subversion. Millions of Downists in the United States were energized by a maverick presidential candidate who appeared to be challenging the political pieties of the era. He criticized the U.S. disastrous wars of aggression in the Middle East. He floated the idea that NATO might be obsolete. He opined that America should get along with Russia and other perceived enemies. He called out his main Republican primary challenger, Ted Cruz, for being bought and sold by Goldman Sachs, who happened to employ Cruz's wife. He stated plainly that globalism is a failed ideology and that it's time to concentrate on domestic affairs. All good, right? But then, predictably enough, for those who understand how the game is played, this downist candidate morphed into an uppist president. Within 100 days, Trump had launched a Tomahawk missile strike in Syria, had an increased U.S. participation in the massacre in Yemen. He had declared NATO to be no longer obsolete after all, and had appointed no less than 5 Goldman Sachs bankers to staff his administration. And just to spell it out for anyone who missed this remarkable transformation from candidate downist to president uppist, Trump assured the Wall Street Journal and its readers, hey, I'm a nationalist and a globalist. I'm both. And I want to point this out for the people in the back of the room. For anyone who bought the narrative that Trump changed, Trump learned all these lessons from his first term and from being out of office, etc., there are I think a dozen billionaires in different parts of his administration. These people have financialized the U.S. economy. Do you really think they're interested in bringing back manufacturing to the United States after they helped outsource it? These people are not going to work against their own interests. And this is why people have been fooled by Trump twice now. They got fooled in the first presidential election, and now they've gotten fooled in this third one that he won. But the point being that he's still, in many ways, a fraud. And people need to end their political naivete. All of us had to do it at some point with some political candidate we believed in. And I'm hoping that at some point people will come to the end of their infatuation with President Trump. He's a fraud. He doesn't really deliver, and in part because he doesn't really have any strongly held beliefs. And when you don't have any strongly held beliefs, you can move wherever you're pushed. And he's often pushed. Now, what about eugenics? In 1907, the first forced sterilization statute was passed in Indiana. By 1914, 12 states had passed similar legislation. In all, over 30 states would go on to pass laws permitting the government to sterilize citizens against their will, and more than 60,000 individuals deemed mentally disabled, ill, or socially disadvantaged would undergo the procedure. So this is something that was normally associated with mustache man bad, and he's the one who does all this stuff. It's not known that in American history we were responsible for these sorts of things and continue to be through different programs that we sponsor in which people are sterilized. Or this idea from the eugenics playbook that people who are of lower genetic status should not be allowed to reproduce, or that you should have to have a license in order to reproduce. These are all crazy ideas. The Buck versus Bell case of 1927 brought the question of the constitutionality of these forced sterilizations before the U.S. Supreme Court. The court decided that the defendant, a woman named Carrie Buck, who had been forcibly committed, along with her mother, to a mental institution for having a child out of wedlock, was feeble-minded and promiscuous. As a result of this designation, the court ruled that the state was justified in having her sterilized. This is a crime against nature and a crime against God. You are not permitted to forcibly sterilize any human for any reason. Writing the Buck versus Bell opinion was Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a rabid eugenicist who advocated executing unfit babies. He concluded his opinion with the infamous declaration, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Of course, feeble-mindedness and imbecility are not clinical descriptions of any sort. What's more, Carrie Buck had conceived her illegitimate child not out of lasciviousness, but because she had been raped by her foster parent's nephew. Even the Virginia government now concedes. Later evidence eventually showed that Buck and many others had no hereditary defects. Nevertheless, the case still stood, and the Supreme Court upheld its opinion that governments have the right to stop their citizens from reproducing. This is an abhorrent idea, an absolutely abhorrent one, and I point out to people who pretend that America is this beacon of freedom and democracy, Go back and learn about your US history. Go back and learn about your Supreme Court rulings. And then let's have a conversation about how much freedom and democracy that the United States is really about. If you're interested in material like this, I have other videos like it on my channel. Consider hitting like, subscribe. It's a free way that you can support the channel and get the news out to other people who might also be interested. What about GMO? Something that I didn't have to deal with in the years that I've been living in France. GMO is illegal in Europe. Contrary to what the biotech giants say in their corporate PR materials, however, GM crops do not produce greater yields. A comprehensive 2009 report by the Union of Concerned Scientists demonstrated that there was no increase in intrinsic yield between genetically modified strains of soybean and corn and their non-modified varieties. This discovery was confirmed by a 2016 National Academy of Sciences report, which found no evidence that GE crops, genetically engineered, had changed the rate of increase in yields in soybean, cotton, or maize in the U.S. The same year, an extensive New York Times investigation examined approximately 30 years of United Nations data and found no discernible difference in yields between Western Europe, where GM crops are not planted, and North America, where they are. So there's not even any scientific reason, if you're arguing for greater yields meaning I get more from a crop based on the same amount of planting, then what's the point? To fund the biotech companies. For its part, the biotech sector likes to tout the research of Dr. Martin Kaim of the University of Göttingen, which suggests that GM crops do in fact enjoy larger yields. According to a meta-analysis of 147 separate studies co-authored by Dr. Kaim, adoption of GM technology increased crop yield by an average of 22%. I mean, that's remarkable if true. When questioned on this finding, however, Dr. Kaim admitted that these yields were possible only in the developing world, where modern farming techniques are not widely implemented. Currently available GM crops would not lead to major yield gains in Europe, he told the New York Times. I don't consider this to be the miracle type of technology that we couldn't live without. So that 22% gain was not due to the biotechnology, so-called, but because they were now using some different modern farming techniques, maybe different types of field rotation or different types of implements to help plow the ground better, that would be what would lead to these increased yields, not the GM. And the doctor supervising the research study said as much. So he doesn't even believe in this 22% number that his own study created and which is touted by the biotech industry. In the biotech industry's eyes, another key selling point of GM crops is that, being genetically engineered to resist pests, they allow farmers to use less pesticide. But what the biotech boosters don't like to admit is that the crops, which are also being engineered to resist herbicides, eventually require farmers to greatly increase their use of these agrochemicals. The best example of this phenomenon is Roundup, the weed killer that was originally manufactured by the Monsanto company and that accounted for nearly half of that company's profit before it was taken over by Bayer AG in 2018. Glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, is now the most used agrochemical in history, with over 1.6 billion kilograms of the chemical having been applied between 1974 and 2016. I shudder to think what this has done to the soils in the United States and other places that have been poisoned by it. I can't even begin to imagine. And we haven't had enough population from this time period to really know how bad it is, but I'm sure we will find out soon enough. A 2016 study found that 72% of that 42-year total was applied in the 10 years from 2006 to 2016. A clear indication that the introduction of Monsanto's Roundup-ready GM crops, engineered to be resistant to glyphosate, has led to a dramatic increase in the use of that very chemical. In fact, a 2009 study, which attempted to quantify this increase, estimated that the use of GM crops has led to U.S. farmers applying 383 million more pounds of herbicide in the 1996 to 2008 period than they would have sprayed had no GM crops been planted. So, I sell you the GM crops, which require more herbicide, which I also sell you. It's right there. The statistics are there for anyone who wants to pay attention, and talk to any farmer about this. I only have a few farming friends, but they can tell you much more about this than can be said just in these few paragraphs. It's all true. This is not even to say the sort of tactics Monsanto uses to go after small farmers who refuse to buy their seeds. That's another conversation. This trend is especially worrying because multiple scientific studies have linked glyphosate to a range of negative health effects on humans. A 2015 study, for example, found that Roundup was both cytotoxic and endocrine disrupting. Also in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the WHO, listed glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. I mean, even the WHO isn't denying it. What does that tell you? That bastion of truth and honesty. So, Corbett often ends his videos or even creates independent one-off videos in which he focuses on solutions, because I think otherwise you can get very black-pilled on things and doom spiral. And I think it's important to be working towards positive outcomes. Not just because you can't change things at a national or international level doesn't mean you can't change things at a local or personal level. And that's something he points out all the time. And here he's echoing something we've talked about before with Atomic Habits by James Clear. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card for that book. In reality, we do vote each and every day, not for some false political savior, but for whomever we choose to associate with, whatever we choose to spend our money on, and however we choose to invest our time and energy. This is the essence of freedom. And Clear says in Atomic Habits, every time we do an action, we're making a vote for the sort of person we want to be. We're taking action in that way. So don't be worried about these shows, these productions, these so-called elections, which are really just selection processes, people who were selected before you had any chance to show up at the ballot box. Focus on what you can do and what you can control. And that's, as he says, the essence of freedom in many, many ways. That's a different conversation about liberty, which is the freedom to do what is right, but I won't go too far into the weeds with that today. Life is not a zero-sum, win-lose competition for a slice of a fixed pie. No, life is a win-win quest for cooperation and exploration and adventure on a beautiful, flourishing, abundant, ever-expanding pie. And I agree with that in the natural order. Obviously, life is a gateway to eternity, and there is a supernatural structure that sits on top of all this. But in the natural order, he's right, so I'll repeat this. Life is not a zero-sum, win-lose competition for a slice of a fixed pie. No, life is a win-win quest for cooperation and exploration and adventure on a beautiful, flourishing, abundant, ever-expanding pie. It's the same thing with, you could say, the race for salvation, the quest for eternity. Everyone can win. It's not a zero-sum race where there can only be one winner. Everyone who runs the race can win. And that's something to look forward to. Now, what does Corbett not get quite right? So, James Corbett is an unapologetic anarchist. And he advocates for it in different parts of the book in different ways. And I just have to foreground this by saying anyone who is an anarchist who is still raising children has a fundamental contradiction in their idea. Because if anarchy is don't have any order and let things just run as it is, how can an anarchist father make choices for his children? Why would that make any sense? Just let the children figure it out for themselves. That would be intellectually consistent. Because the idea is, for anarchists, is leave everything alone and everything will order itself. The problem is this is on its own an anti-scientific idea. Think of the second law of thermodynamics. The idea that if I leave something, it's going to become more ordered over time. That's the opposite, right? If I leave something, it's going to become more disordered over time. The anarchist idea is just leave it and everything will run fine. This is a questionable proposition, even in the natural order. So forget about religion and forget about higher philosophies. Just think about this as a concept. It doesn't make any sense. So here are the arguments he marshals forward. To those of us who have been programmed to see government as the fountainhead of law and order, it is almost incomprehensible that order, not to mention peace and harmony, is to be achieved by the dissolution of government. Yet the belief in the need for government, deeply ingrained by the Prussian education system, must be directly challenged. So, again, I point back, he has children. So the idea is there is a need for government. Unless you just believe that everyone in the family is equal. The children is equal to the father is equal to the children. There is no authority in the house. It's just coincidental. There is a need for order. And in fact, we do it all the time in our society. consciously or no. And that's not because of some cultural programming. It is totally natural. We see it cross-culturally, across time periods, across religions. There is a natural hierarchy to things. We see it in the jungle. We see it out on the on the savannah of Africa. There is an order to things. There's a hierarchy to herds. The idea that there should be no order and everything will be fine, again, I find silly. One of the first to contest this indoctrination was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the 19th century French thinker who was the first self-identified anarchist. In his 1851 treatise, General Idea of the Revolution in the 19th Century, Proudhon dismantled the pieties of statist society with breathtaking ferocity. To be governed is to be kept in sight, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, estimated, valued, censured, commanded, by creatures who have neither the right, nor the wisdom, nor the virtue to do so. There are plenty of people who would be opposed to all that, but do you know who has delivered that? That has not been delivered by the monarchies and the governmental regimes of old. He's writing in 1851. This sort of behavior is much more likely to come from an atheist, liberal, democratic state, which considers itself to be the highest order on earth. That there is no religion, there is no God, nothing to report to. We are the authority. They're going to do that. The idea that in the 1300s, listen, I just want to repeat this. Let's go back to the 1300s. Is it likely in the 1300s you were being inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, estimated, valued, censured, commanded? This just wasn't happening. For most of human history, the idea of government wasn't extensive centralization run by a technocratic elite with some kind of ideas of transhumanism. That is not how most of human society was built. So there's a transmutation here of taking these ideas, rightfully repugnant, and then saying that's what it means to be governed. That's not true. That's just ahistorical. To be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction, noted, registered, enrolled, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished. Again, Corbett says he dismantles the pieties of statist society with breathtaking ferocity. But this is just hyperbole. I've lived in France, I've lived in the United States, I've lived in Singapore. The idea that you can't buy or sell things. There are all sorts of transactions that happen every day in all three of those countries that are not taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, etc. Just think of your classic Facebook marketplace. In France, they have something called Le Bon Coin, where you meet someone at a train station, you give them €5, and they give you a coffee maker, or whatever it might be. That happens all the time. But he's saying that, that can't happen because to be governed is all of this other stuff. It is under pretext of public utility and in the name of the general interest to be placed under contribution, trained, ransomed, exploited, monopolized, extorted, squeezed, mystified, robbed. Then, at the slightest resistance, the first word of complaint, to be repressed, fined, despised, harassed, tracked, abused, clubbed, disarmed, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, and to crown all, mocked, ridiculed, derided, outraged, dishonored. That is government. That is its justice. That is its morality. And take elements of that, and can we say that certainly happened during COVID, where people were told that they were science deniers or that they didn't trust the government or they didn't trust the science? 100%. But the idea that this is the normal operation of government, or that is normally how order and authority works, is hyperbole at best and dishonest at worst. What right does a government have to rule over its people, and what makes its people beholden to its laws? I would go back to the father. What right does a father have to rule over his children? If he questions the right of anybody to rule, which is what anarchy is doing, how do you then have a right to be in charge of your children? There's a direct connection because the family is the basis of society, not the individual. The family is the basis of society. Individuals are accidental to society, but without families, there is no society. And so if he's questioning the right of a government to rule over people, then he's questioning fundamentally the right of a father to rule over his family, which I find incoherent for somebody who dedicated the book to his family. He has a verse in French basically saying, I did my best. The obvious truth, of course, is that no would-be ruler, whether a single monarch or a handful of plutocrats or a military junta or a parliament or even one's next-door neighbor, has any intrinsic authority to rule over another human. That's true. They don't have authority in and of themselves. But any authority over us has authority by God. So the father of a child has a natural authority by being the father of the progeny. Makes sense. We even see this in the animal kingdom, when a mama cat punishes her little kitten and slaps it on the face. But there's also a supernatural authority given by God. Christ articulates this to Pilate when he says, do you not know I have the power to crucify you? And he says, you would not have any authority if it were not given to you by God. So there, even the pagan Roman authorities were given their power by God to rule. And that's probably a longer political discussion. But the idea is to oppose authority in government is to question authority even at the atomic level of human life, at the family level. And if you can't articulate a reason for authority to exist at the government level, it means that you can't articulate a reason for authority to exist at any level. I don't see a way to disconnect those ideas. Whether we're discussing law and order or the New World Order or order out of chaos, we're ultimately talking about the same thing, an order based on a hierarchical view of society, in which the lawmakers and their corporate cronies seek to regulate, prescribe, manipulate, inhibit, and control the actions of the masses. I agree with this characterization in the modern era. But it is silly, again, let's go back to the 1300s. Is it true that the lawmakers and their corporate cronies in the 1300s were seeking to regulate, prescribe, manipulate, inhibit, and control the actions of the masses? Certainly there were guilds which controlled, if I wanted to be, I don't know, a bootmaker in Ghent in this time period, I would need to apply to the guild, and there would need to be an opening. And once that opening was had, I was basically set for life. If I died, the guild had insurance to take care of my family. Yes, but was that the government? No, these were guilds, and that would still imply a hierarchy to society. The government didn't enforce guilds. Guilds grew up organically. And there's still a hierarchy. And Corbett is all about organic items. But if we even see the organic growth of things, they don't organically grow up to be anarchical. And there's no culture, no society that has lasted, which has come from this anarchical framework. So like the people who say, well, communism just hasn't ever been tried. That's why you don't have any good case studies. Corbett would say, well, anarchism just hasn't been tried. That's why we don't see any case studies. It's unnatural. It's not anything that appeals to us. It doesn't sit with us even in a natural situation where you don't have any cultural influences. We see it out in remote tribes in the jungle. There's still a hierarchy. Who programmed them to do that? Was that the big government that programmed them to think that way? The principle of spontaneous order has arguably been around since the 4th century BC, when Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi conceived the idea that good order results spontaneously when things are let alone. It was further developed in the 18th century by Scottish Enlightenment intellectuals and in the 19th century by thinkers like Frederick Bastiat. Not until the 20th century, however, was the theory of spontaneous order named, codified, and popularized by Austrian-born philosopher and economist F.A. Hayek. In his 1966 article on the principles of a liberal social order, Hayek describes spontaneous order this way. The central concept of liberalism is that under the enforcement of universal rules of just conduct, protecting a recognizable private domain of the individuals, a spontaneous order of human activities of much greater complexity will form itself than could ever be produced by deliberate arrangement. When put into ordinary English, Hayek's observation is at once embarrassingly simple and surprisingly profound. The social order that arises from the free choice of individuals acting to protect their own interests will always be more secure and more complex than any rationally ordered, centrally controlled system could ever be. Who is Corbett arguing against? Are there lots of advocates for a centrally controlled system of government among people? If he's arguing against the government, great. But the idea that everybody wants a centrally controlled government, or that if you believe in an ordered hierarchical view of society, that you want a centrally controlled system. He also conveniently, eliminates the first part of the sentence of Hayek. He says, under the enforcement of universal rules of just conduct, protecting a recognizable private domain of the individuals. Who would have the authority to do that? And So Corbett cuts out the first part in which there is a hierarchy, there is order, ostensibly enforced by a hierarchical society. That's true. That's how you get 400 or 500 types of cheese in France. It was because people were free to develop the cheese. That's how you got champagne, how champagne was invented. Because in a very stable Christian order in France, people were free to pursue things. And they did. So this idea that even under the French kings, which many people think is this horrible despotic regime, the king did not interfere in what type of cheese you were making. He wasn't interested in your licenses. All of that is now. That's the European Union. That's modern so-called liberal democracies. They're in there invading every part of your social life so that you get arrested for social media posts. That is what he's talking about. But he's using that to then argue against all hierarchical societies and even the concept of a hierarchical society, which I find to be, unfortunately, very weak on Corbett's part. And it's a huge lacuna in his worldview and the way that he thinks about things. This concept of spontaneous order and self-governance, radical as it may appear to our 21st century selves, is timeless wisdom that has been passed down through the generations for thousands of years. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu put it this way in chapter 57 of the Tao Te Ching more than 2 millennia ago. Do not control the people with laws, nor violence nor espionage, but conquer them with inaction. For the more morals and taboos there are, the more cruelty afflicts people. The more guns and knives there are, the more factions divide people. The more arts and skills there are, the more change obsoletes people. The more laws and taxes there are, the more theft corrupts people. Yet take no action, and the people nurture each other. Make no laws, and the people deal fairly with each other. Own no interest, and the people cooperate with each other. Express no desire, and the people harmonize with each other. This is a utopist, fantasy view of human nature. That if people are just left alone, they will always act virtuously. The big problem with this is original sin. Humans do not only do they not act in the best interest of society, they just sometimes don't even act in their own best interest. They cheat on their wives. So let's pretend we have no law against adultery. So now people aren't going to cheat on their spouses? This is a crazy way of thinking, that if there's no laws, people will be good. This has been proven not to be true. And even when we go back, for example, to the repugnant Aztec civilization, in which the hearts of 13-year-old virgin girls were ripped out of their chests to sacrifice to their demon deity, that this would fall under what Corbett is saying: leave people alone, leave the Aztecs to do what they want. And if we had left the Aztecs to do what they want, if Cortez and other people hadn't intervened, the other tribes around the Aztecs who provided the source for these sacrifices, part of the reason the Aztecs were defeated was because all of the people they had enslaved around them allied with the Spaniards to take them down. So the idea that, if we just leave people alone, they'll be good. This is naive in the extreme, but it also flies in the face of our lived experience. What is the reality of human experience? Is it that if we have no laws, if we have no morality, that everyone will be good? This is ahistorical. And as I say, this thinking of Corbett's undermines some of his arguments and is a big problem. But as I would say, it's only 15% bad. If you're mindful of this contradiction of him arguing against a hierarchical society yet still purporting to be the father of his family, then you can still gain a lot of helpful intelligence from this book. For me particularly, I learned a lot about the sterilization programs in America that I wasn't aware of before. If you'd like to support this channel, a free way you can do so is by hitting like, subscribe, as I appealed to you doing earlier in the video. Share this with someone who's interested in some of these ideas or who you might have argued about anarchism with before. If you want to buy a copy of this book, there's a link in the description below. That's another way you can support this channel. If you want to thank me for this presentation, there's links to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee below. If you'd like to get early editions of videos like this one, there's Patreon and YouTube membership below. That's a way that you can get access, like I said, early access, but also videos that I don't release to the general public that are members only, usually Q&A and usually discussions of other things that I'm reading that I don't necessarily cover on the channel. If you're interested in other topics, whether it be France, Palestine, those two things are clearly not related. There's also links to my different channels that I participate in the description. Until next time, enjoy your reading.